In this lecture, I'll introduce the content namespace. First, I'll briefly explain the concept of the content namespace and content information. Then, I'll introduce the Content Manager class used to create, delete, and change content, the Content Search class used to search for content, and the Content Transfer class used to send data to the server. Content is a logical representation of various types of media files. The content namespace enables collecting these logical representations into a database and sharing them between applications. The content-related APIs require the local content privilege group for local content and the remote content privilege group for content on the server. Remote content-related APIs require the system privilege level. Let's see how we can manage content. Managing content means creating, deleting, and updating content. You can perform these operations using the Content Manager class for local content or the Remote Content Manager class for remote content. You can also search for content. To search for content, you can use the Content Search and Remote Content Search classes using a search query that follows a similar syntax to SQL. Finally, the Content Transfer class is used to upload content to the server or to download content from the server. First, I'll explain local content. Local content has content info, which includes the classification, category or type, keyword, and format items. Basic information includes the name, size, description, author, and date-time information. You can also add information such as the location tag, coordinates, provider, rating, and thumbnail. Depending on the content type, each content type can save its own unique information. For example, image content can have width, height, and title information in the Image Content Info class. A local content has 4 predefined types. Remote Content Info has slightly different characteristics from local content. First, the Remote Content Info class has the language, user ID, status, brief description, thumbnail path, and size information items in addition to the information of the local content info class. The most important difference between remote content and local content is that the remote content type is not determined. Therefore, an application can specify a type. You can specify various items in the information of the remote content in the Application Manager on the developer website. For your reference, Bada uses the Amazon S3 service for remote content. To manage content, you can use the Content Manager for local content, and you can use the Remote Content Manager for remote content. These classes basically support the Create Content, Delete Content, Get Content Info, and Update Content functions. Besides these functions, the Remote Content Manager provides the Get Content Status function, which can be used to identify whether the current content has been drafted or published. Now, I'll show you how to create, update, and delete local content using some sample code. First, I defined the Content Manager, constructed the Content Manager, and constructed the content info for the content to be added. Here, I specified the content path parameter and called the create content function, passing the manager information. This function returns the content ID. Using this returned ID, you can perform update or delete operations. Now, let's see how we can get content information. If the returned ID is a valid ID, the content information is acquired from the manager by calling the getContentInfoN function. I specified the keyword in this information to change, and I called the update content function to save the changed information. you can delete content by calling the delete content function. Now let's have a look at how we can search for content. For local content, you can search for content by calling the content search class. The types of the columns in the database are content type, file name, size, category, author, and date time. You can search for content using a keyword, the artist, genre, composer, or album. First, the getValueListEn function sorts the content into a column and returns the result in a list. The searchEnd function returns the actual contents that satisfy the condition. Let's have a look at the parameters in detail. First, the page defines the page number when a number of content items are acquired in multiple pages. The count per page defines the number of items per page. The total page returns the total number of pages, and the total count returns the total number of items. Where EXPR is the actual query to be used for the search. In the latter part, the sort column and sort order parameters are also passed to specify the column to be used as the basis for the sorting and the order of the sorting. Let me show you the sample code that implements the actual content search. First, to search for content, I created an instance of the content search class and constructed the object by setting the content type to audio. This means that I'll search for audio content. Then, I specified the page number as 1 and the count per page as 5. This means that I'll get 5 items per page, and I'll get the data of the first page. Then, if I call the searchEnd function, the total page and the total count values are returned. As you can see in the query expression, the artist is set to rain, the genre is set to dance, the sort column is set to release year, and the sort order is set to descending. When this function is executed, the function returns the list of items corresponding to the page. This list has search result objects, and you can access the contents by using the object. Now let's see how content is transferred to and from the server. Basically, content is transferred asynchronously. Transferring content is performed asynchronously through the iContentTransferListener object. The actual functions of the content transfer are the download, download to buffer, and upload functions. To use these content transfer functions, the content transfer privilege is required. Now I'll explain the OMA type content download in detail. OMA refers to the Open Mobile Alliance, which is the protocol to standardize mobile services. First, the application creates and constructs the content transfer class and specifies the information of the content to retrieve. Then, the download is started using the content transfers download function. Next, the onDownload descriptor received function of the listener is called. If the OMA download function is called, the content is actually downloaded. OnContent Transfer in Progress is the notification function that notifies the user of the percentage of the download. When the content transfer is complete, the OnContent Transfer Completed function is called. Let me explain again with the help of an example. In this example, we'll download content that corresponds to the predetermined remote content info of the device. As you can see, I first constructed the content transfer class with the listener object parameter. In addition, I got the content path and size from the remote content info. Then, I called the download function of the content transfer using this information. The download path specifies the local path to save the content to. Then, the onDownload descriptor receive function of the listener object is called. The request ID, and the download descriptor are passed. If I call the OMA download function with this descriptor, the actual content is downloaded. Additionally, when the content download is complete, the onContentDownloadCompleted function is called. To upload content, you can use the upload function of the content transfer class. In this case, the first parameter is the path of the local content, and the second is the path on the server. Then you have to specify the URI of the server. When content is uploaded using this function and the upload is completed, the onContentTransferCompleted function of the listener object is called. Now, let's wrap up this lecture. The content namespace provides various functions to access the content database. Content is classified into the content stored on the local device and content stored on the server. You can search for content from the content database, and you can download or upload the content to the server using the content transfer class.